Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Informa Parthenon EY webinar this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us all today. Today's webinar is hosted by Ashwin Asomal, Managing Director at Parthenon EY, and will focus on lessons and considerations for operators and investors in private higher education in MENA. The webinar today will be recorded, and the audio file will be sent after you if you'd like to refer back to anything. We'd like to encourage you today to ask questions during the webinar using the question box on the Citrix platform. These will be answered by Ashwin at the end of the session. Please do also look out over the coming days for some emails that will be sent to you by Informa, offering you some discounts as a thanks for attending this webinar. I'd also like to remind you that Ashwin will be presenting at the Education Investment MENA event taking place on the 16th and 17th of November, and we will also send you details about this and Ashwin's participation. So now I will hand over the controls to Ashwin. As I said, please do join us questions, and Ashwin will be staying around at the end of his presentation to answer them. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Lydia. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and I hope the technology will not fail us on this occasion. Lydia, thanks for the introduction. This is the fourth year, I think, in a row that Parthenon has been working very closely with the Informa team to create what I think is the best education investment conference that we participate in globally, and it's great that it happens in MENA every year. This year we are supporting Informa with a number of information sessions, the webinar being one of them, but as Lydia said, we'll be speaking at a couple of panels, sharing our expertise and perspectives on some of the trends that we see in MENA over the course of the couple of days of the conference, which is fast approaching. So the focus of the discussion today, and I think what we've observed over the last few years, is there's always been a really keen interest in the K-12 space, schools, but increasingly there is a move towards understanding more about how investors can participate in the rapidly growing higher education space across MENA. And of course, Dubai has been very, very strong in terms of the way it's been able to attract private operators and public operators into its markets. But hopefully what we'll be able to share today with some of the data that we have is that there are other opportunities across the region for investors to participate in. And then we'll talk a little bit about where are the potential value drivers and what can you do to actually build a university of real scale, drive enrollments, and increase increase profitability and create a business that is attractive to investors. So without further ado, let me start with a very brief introduction on Parthenon, talk a little bit about the global higher education context after that, and compare that to what's happening in MENA, and then give you some more insights into the trends in MENA, and then talk about the opportunities for growth with a specific focus on Dubai, because I think there is a lot that we can learn from Dubai, but I think Dubai still has a long way to go, because there are significant opportunities specifically in the transnational education, attracting international students to Dubai space. So that's the agenda for today. And let me start with a brief introduction of Parthenon. We're a strategic advisory firm spun out of Bain & Company. We have around 270 members. The numbers keep on changing, but essentially we focus on a number of sectors. Education is a prime sector for us, along with healthcare and consumer goods. Of the 300-odd members that we have, around 150 focus wholly and solely on education. I lead all of our work in education in the MENA region, but our international education practice, as you will see on this slide, covers the whole world, from the US, Latin America, through to Africa, where we're seeing a lot of traction, private investment, through to Asia, and we also cover Australia. We cover every segment of education, from early years, K-12, higher ed, and some of the more abstract, smaller segments such as English language training and after schools training, but also transnational education, which is all about students moving across borders for education, is a very, very important segment for us, and we've seen a lot of growth, not only in the public sector, but in the private sector. So our practice completes about 150 education projects per year. We work in 80 countries worldwide. We've done over 1,000 projects, and we put our people into these markets, help them collect the data, get a real clear perspective of what's happening in terms of the trends, in terms of the markets, the regulation, what is happening in terms of how investors are viewing these markets, and we help our investors and help the operators formulate the right strategies to enter these markets. So whilst our focus is on MENA today, we are a very global practice, and some of these global best practices are quite important as you think about building businesses even within MENA. Within the higher education sector, yes, we work with some of the prestigious names in higher education, in the US especially, schools like Tufts and Harvard, but we also work with a number of private universities, companies like Laureate, the largest private higher education company in the world, DeVry, which is a US-based firm which has expanded across the world, including Latin America, and has a positioning in Saudi. But we also work with higher education institutions that are not pure universities, companies like Navitas and Study Group that are pathway providers that help build foundation programs to allow students to migrate from one part of the world to another, and they work closely with the university. So higher education is a critical part of everything that we do. Within the region, as you'll see, we've worked for a mixture of investors as well as operators, but also increasingly with governments. We work with the KHDA and ADEC, and we're increasingly working with Tamkeen, which is part of the government of Dubai. So that's the sort of brief introduction to Parthenon, but let's talk a little bit about the global higher education market. And here's where it gets interesting. And then the data that we've been collecting over the last few years has been summarized for some of these key markets. And so on slide 8, what you'll see is an overview of the private higher education market by country. And interestingly, China, Brazil, and India are very, very large markets. And in comparison to what we see in K-12, in fact, China and India are quite small, but the higher education sectors in these markets, in these countries, has actually been very supportive of private higher education, and some large institutions have managed to build up as a result. Now, what's happening in our region? Well, from what you can see in the red circle is that Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Qatar, which is where we're focusing most of the rest of the presentation on, are much smaller, but they're growing at quite considerably faster clip than some of the more established markets. And we'll dig in a little bit into more data and more detail on these MENA markets in the next section. But before we do that, let's talk about what's actually happening across MENA. And what you can see, and this is the thing that keeps governments up at night, is whilst there's a very clear correlation for most economies, non-oil economies, between the wealth per capita and the tertiary enrollment ratio. So the tertiary enrollment ratio is the number of students, number of children going to a higher education institution as a percentage of the total potential age-going population, so 18 to 23-year-olds that can go to university or another higher education institute, what percentage are going. So you'll see the USA and Singapore have very high tertiary enrollment ratios, as does South Korea, but the oil-based economies like Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE have considerably lower tertiary enrollment ratios. And why this chart, whilst it looks complicated, is important to internalize is that it shows that there is a very clear correlation between the wealth of a nation, the wealth of individuals in a nation, and the level of higher education penetration. And that's why all of these governments are really pushing hard to drive enrollments into higher education, because they realize it will be key to delivering a sustainable, wealthy economy when the oil prices the oil prices have come down now, but when the oil runs out. Let's talk a little bit about the high-level statistics. So if you look at the annual enrollment growth, so these are CAGRs that we're talking about, between 2010 and 2013, you will see that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have grown between 9 and 15%. There are, these are pretty punchy growth rates overall, and the UAE is slightly lower, but it's also because it's a larger market growing from a smaller base. When you look at private enrollment, which is really where we're going to focus our discussion, the private sector across MENA markets and across many markets within Africa and Asia have been gaining share. So this is something that we see even in China, which has traditionally relied on the public sector, where they're opening up the private sector for more operators to come in, and it is driving enrollments into the private sector. And then there are a couple of things. One is that the private sector is able to deliver good quality education with respect to getting the kids into jobs afterwards, and that's been very, very key in some of the things that Dubai has been doing, and that's key in what we see in other markets such as Malaysia. But also in many markets, the government has actually retreated from investing in more public sector seats, because the belief is that the private sector can do a good job, and it is a very expensive proposition to build out a higher education sector in many of these economies. Let's dig a little bit deeper on slide 13. What you'll see is each of these markets split by the different types of operators. And what's important to understand here is in Dubai, what you'll see is that there is a pretty nice mix of international brands with some of the local operators as well. And the international brands are not only the Australian and the British brands, but there are Eastern Asian brands. You have the likes of BITS and Manipur, who are relatively small, but through the Knowledge City and Academic City and the free zones, Dubai has managed to build one of the most vibrant transnational education markets, in that it's gotten quite a few, I think it's over 35 branch campuses to come into Dubai. Saudi Arabia, as you'll see, this is just private higher education, is much more dominated by some of the local operators. Qatar has a mix of really the prestige universities that have come and set up camps there, and Abu Dhabi also has some of the more local operators as part of the mix. So that's how the market breaks up. The 5 largest operators in each of these markets take up anything between 40 and 80% of the overall market. So what's going to drive growth going forward, and what has been driving growth? And some of this stuff is obvious, but we'll show you the data behind it. One is increasing expat demand, and traditionally there are still there's still a decent cohort of expats that tend to go home for university. So lots of the Brits will go home for university, but one of the things that we've seen is as fees in Britain, for example, increase in their local universities, and now with the new regulations, universities can each charge up to £9,000 each. There will be some movement away from Brits going back if they can find a good quality education abroad, and why shouldn't that be in MENA? And what's really also driving demand is that there are some good foreign branch universities coming in to this region, and if you can get a job afterwards, it's a great place to go and have a higher education as well. There's a lot of increasing local demand. The private sector is growing, but the government is very keen to ensure that their population, their students, land up in good quality institutions where they've got a good chance of getting a job. And private universities are increasingly seen by families locally as a good way and a good means of getting into the labor market. The government is also investing behind a number of initiatives to bring in universities, and they are very keen to bring in private universities. Dubai has made it relatively easy for that, for universities to enter. And of course, Qatar has attracted universities to come in on the back of the relationship with Qatar Foundation. Again, one of the things that we see for higher education across the region is the successful universities that have grown strongly have really focused on employability-related courses and have tried to ensure that they have a high percentage of their children who graduate, the students who graduate, getting into jobs. So let's just show you some of the data. When you look at the expatriates, expatriates form about 80% of the UAE's population, Qatar's population, and that's a market that you have to go after. In Saudi Arabia, when you target your students, it's actually the local students that you need to target. And of course, there have been lots of initiatives within post-secondary education in Saudi Arabia, like the Colleges of Excellence program that's tried to get more kids into vocational programs. But essentially, as you think about these markets, this is a market where you have to cater towards expatriates as well as locals. But in Saudi Arabia, it's much more of a local Saudi market. To cater to expats, what do you need to do? You need to provide a range of foreign brands, and as you can see, Dubai and Abu Dhabi have done that quite well. Dubai has, as I say, has brought in some very reputable names recently, including the Manchester Business School, the London Business School. They also have CAS here. Abu Dhabi has also brought in Strathclyde, and of course NYU, which is where I'm actually speaking from today. The critical thing, which we will speak about towards the end of this presentation, is it's great to bring all these institutions in, but it's really important to also bring some international students, and there is a big international student flow happening year after year. Students heading out from China, heading out from Malaysia, South Korea to study in the UK and the US and Australia. And the Parthenon view is, why can't these great institutions that are set up in the Middle East attract those students who frequently fly through Dubai and Abu Dhabi to get to the UK or to get to the US from their home markets? And we'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation. If you think about local demand, again, talking a little bit more about Saudi, if you look at this, the age, the population for students that could go to higher education, that has grown since 2004, sort of plateauing out at 2.4 million in 2013. But essentially, there is a government push to move that gross enrollment ratio, the tertiary enrollment ratio, up. And as you can see, that has moved up significantly from 28% to 58% over the last few years. So there is this increasing local demand. It's not only about demographics, it's demographics to a certain extent, but it's really a government push and also a family push where families realize that in order to be able to get a job and to be able to sustain themselves, you will need to get a good higher education. And as you can see, and this is something that most of you who are interested in education work in the region, actually countries in the Middle East do spend a high proportion of their budget on education. And the question here always is where are the public-private partnerships that you can participate in as an investor to ensure you get some of those dollars. A little bit more about the government investment, and I don't want to labor this point, but the government has invested in building world-class research institutions, which are not essentially privately funded. They are public or not-for-profit institutions, but it just re-emphasizes the point that they're looking for very strong academic outcomes, centers of excellence to help them build service-based, knowledge-based economies and the government is extremely serious about higher education as one of its key strategic initiatives for growth and diversification. This is true across the whole of the MENA region. One thing that you will hear from Parthenon when you come to any of our conferences around higher education is the need to offer programs that are catered to helping kids get into school, to get into jobs. So employment and employability related courses are absolutely key. When you go and speak to students, whether they are in China, in India, in Brazil, in this part of the world, their top selection criteria for getting into a university is the employment opportunity. Now, infrastructure is taken as a given. Fees, yes, they're important to some extent. The academic, the teachers, all of that is great. And we've seen a lot of folk invest a lot in the infrastructure and build great campuses. But what's really important is that you invest in your career service, because what these students want, and they're rational, is if they're making an investment in your private university and paying, you know, $8,000 to $10,000 a year, what they want is a return on that investment, and that means they would like to get a job. And this is a survey. It's a small survey. It's only 51 students, but we asked them what were their top selection criteria. And these are only Emiratis and other Arab students in Dubai. But the critical criteria, the one that was mentioned most, was employment opportunities. And what you'll see is when you look at Dubai, this is a case study of Dubai, for the foreign branch campuses, and those are the branch campuses that have grown quite strongly. Now that's the segment that's performed really well in Dubai. That segment has around 80% of its courses in what we believe are employment-related courses. So you won't have things like, you know, marketing. You won't have things like humanities and philosophy and other social sciences. It's actually business or engineering and IT, which are the most employability-related courses out there. Of course, medicine's there as well, but the foreign branch campuses are focused on this winning formula of these three disciplines. The other thing that's really, really important, especially in markets like Saudi, where getting better levels of English is very, very important for folks looking to work in the service sector. It's really, really important that you have a good proportion of your faculty that is Western or speaks English as its mother tongue. And you can see the difference in Saudi between the public universities and the private universities around the level of Western faculty. And again, you will need to configure your business plan as you enter some of these markets to ensure that you get the Western faculty. It's harder to attract that Western faculty in certain markets than others. And you know, Dubai is a relatively easy market to get faculty into. Saudi, less so. So let's come on to talk a little bit about one of the areas that we are very passionate about at Parthenon, which is this area around transnational education. So how can we get those hundreds of thousands of students that are literally getting on a flight every year to go abroad, how can we get more of them to come to our region? Because we've got world-class infrastructure, we've got phenomenal connectivity, we've got some great branded universities, but still these students choose to go fly right over our heads and to those traditional markets like the US and the UK. And one of the things that's very important to recognize in Dubai is that they really have made it very, very easy through the free trade zones to allow universities to enter. They've done a great job in getting some of these brands to come in. It's an easy market to enter relative to some of the other ones, but that doesn't mean that they have done a great job in terms of recruiting international students. I think that's where everybody in the region is sort of missing a trick. There's a real opportunity to bring those dollars into the market. And of course, the Australian government, the UK government, and increasingly the US government understands the sheer economic impact of having international students come abroad, come to their market, study for 3 years, potentially get a job there, but they will spend a significant amount over the 3 years whilst they're there. So let's talk a little bit about that market. So we see transnational hubs as even Canada, US, UK. We see in Dubai there's only 6,000 pure transnational students, folks that have just gotten on the plane and come to Dubai. Everyone thinks that the higher education sector in Dubai is extremely international, but when you go in and unpick the data, what you'll see is that many of the so-called international students, yes, they're non-Emiratis, so they are international in that respect, are actually second and third generation Dubai residents that have been, are either from India, Pakistan, or some of the other areas that they've moved from, but essentially they are Dubai locals but they just don't have, they're just not Emiratis. So it's actually a really small number, 26,000 students that are pure international students. Compare that with the UK, compare that with Australia, and just if you think about how much revenue that can bring in, it is considerable, and it's something that, as I say, not only countries have recognized, but cities as well. So you've seen Boris Johnson go off to China and try and attract more students from Beijing, and promoting London as a study abroad hub. So what is Dubai's value proposition? How can it compete? Well, we recognize that the US and the UK for many students will be the first choice, and it'll be a dream. It's something they've always wanted. But how can you convince even 10% of the cohort that's looking to go to the UK or US to come to Dubai? And a lot of the ingredients are already in place. You have a high level of employability related courses here in Dubai. When we went out and surveyed students, and we'll show you some of the data, the student satisfaction levels were quite high. And it's a great location, from a safety point of view, from an accessibility point of view as well. So if you look at the employment-related courses, I mean, we talked about it earlier, but if you look at and business is one of the most employable disciplines out there, but 79% of the Western foreign branch campuses, 79% of the business enrollments are in Western branch campuses. So there's a lot of business being offered, and the only point we're trying to make here is the employability-related courses are a major part of everything that Dubai does, regardless of whether it's a Western branch campus. The satisfaction levels of students are very, very high. Now, you can see that here that job placement record is something that that is sort of secondary, but the quality of institutions was first when we looked at when we talked to these students, and essentially the bars show what is really, really important to students, and the line shows what is important to students who've recently graduated, shown by the red line, and the black line shows students that are currently in the system. And these are all international students. So Dubai is performing well. It's between 6 and a 7. People are happy. But the issue is there are far too few students, international students in Dubai, than there should be. There should be more, and there are things that are standing in the way. For example, we always have this conversation with some of the policymakers and higher education leaders here, where they say that we tell them that Dubai doesn't have enough student activity, and it should allow more student activity. And they say, well, we've got lots of activities for everyone. Dubai is a great place. But there are certain things for students that are very, very important. And having access to some of the leisure activities, having access to bars and clubs is very important, and they need that at a decent price point. So there are things that Dubai could do in terms of its infrastructure, but overall, the students that are here are very happy. So how could we make them advocates for Dubai and attract more students into these markets and help private universities double and treble their enrollments, because right now they're more or less relying on local demand. And anyone who lives in Dubai, of course, knows all of this stuff, which is, it's very accessible, it's very safe. For Chinese students, it's very, very important to have an English education, which you will get at most of these universities. You need a very strong economy in and around the region that can hire these graduates post-graduation. Which we still have, and then they want a quality of life, and there are a few things that Dubai needs to do to make itself more student friendly. But overall, it's a very attractive city in terms of quality of life. So our view, and this is something that is important not only for you as a private operator or investor in higher education, if you want to bring in more international students, but I think there's a view that the government could do more, and we could form consortiums like folks in Australia have done, in fact states like Colorado and the US have done. The UKTI is doing a lot of work to promote education in Britain. How can we develop education Dubai or education MENA, or whoever wants to take the mantle on? How can we promote, have a more institutional approach to attracting international students into MENA, into the great private universities that were already there? It's really important to find the right source countries. Now, in many cases, you might be tempted to go after the same source countries that the UK and the US have gone after, China, India. But is there scope to go after folks in Africa? Is there scope to go after folks, students who want to study abroad, who are going from the local region, from other parts of MENA, and bring them into Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, and potentially Saudi Arabia? And it's really, really important to have a very clear message as to why do you want to come to our institution? Why should you come to Dubai? How do we differentiate ourselves from the the traditional markets and the traditional universities that you've gone to? And it's really key to build relationships with agents. And anyone who's discussed transnational education with Parthenon in the past will know that the view that we have, and it's backed up by data, is that the local agents who sit on the ground in China, in Malaysia, in South Korea, in Nigeria are very, very important in influencing parents to their eventual destination. So parents in China, about 50% of parents still use an agent as part of their decision-making process, and they will be very, very involved in selecting the university for the child. And if you want to succeed in bringing in more international students as a private operator, as a private higher education operator, wherever you are in the world, if you want to bring those international students in, you'll have to work with agents and potentially some of these study abroad companies like Study Group and Navitas as well. So that's the end of the presentation. I would like to open it up to anyone who has questions, and I'd be pleased to answer them. And I think there's a place, and Lydia can direct you on the webinar, where you can type in a question and I can respond to it.
Hi all, thank you very much for joining us for that part of the presentation. What we'll be doing now is just asking Ashwin some of the questions that have been sent through. So please do continue to send them through to us, and we'll share them over with Ashwin so that he can start answering them for you.
Great. Lydia, I can't see any questions at the moment, so let me know if you get some.
Okay, Ashwin, so one of the questions that we have coming up here has been, do you see other Emirates apart from Dubai and Abu Dhabi as being attractive to transnational students?
Within the UAE, I think when you look at, and we have good relationships with the Ras Al Khaimah as well. It can be a bit more challenging because the infrastructure that Dubai and Abu Dhabi have is a little bit ahead, and also the awareness of Dubai, which is still pretty low amongst the traditional student markets, the Chinas, the Malaysias, the South Koreas, the Nigerias of the world. It's still very low, but it's higher than some of the other Emirates. So right now, where we stand, I think everybody needs to make the investment in building awareness and building a clear value proposition for themselves. So why is Fujairah a great place to come? What is different about your Emirate in terms of what you have on offer? And this may be around specific disciplines or operators that you have where you can start recruiting in more students. But it is, I think Dubai and Abu Dhabi right now is still ahead.
Great, thank you very much. We have another question that's come through that's asking that today's presentation has focused a lot on the Gulf and that we talk a lot about the higher education market in the Gulf. Can you comment about the potential for the higher education market in North Africa and specifically Egypt, where there's a particularly large local market?
Great, yeah, and I will have to defer on that to some extent. One of my partners does a lot of work in that area, but based on some of the work that I've seen, what you see in North Africa, but also across the whole of Africa, is some of the trends that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, which is there is a massive drive in terms of the enrollment ratio. So more and more students want to go to university, and they can afford to go into university, because what drives demand for private education? It's demographics, it's affordability, people moving into the affordability cohort, and then it's penetration, it's this desire to get educated because they want to have a better life, and they realize that education is the way to higher incomes. So what you see broadly, not only in Egypt, but when we look at Tunisia and Morocco, is that there is growth, and there's more growth in the private sector because those private sector institutions are coming up with offerings that are much more focused on employability. The government is not investing as much in its public sector provision. And we've seen all of these markets, including Egypt, come up with some really, I would say, successful private operator models. And those private operator models are being looked at by a number of private equity houses across the region, because they recognize that there's an opportunity there to create for want of a better phrase, a laureate of Africa. So I think the answer to the question, whilst I don't have any exact specific details on the Egypt market, I think it's a buoyant market. And for private higher education, I think you're going to see a lot of activity in that market, and I think there's also already been some announcements on some of the private equity firms that have invested in North Africa behind private universities. So it is a market very much worth looking at.
Great, thank you very much. Another question has been whether you're able to comment on trends within Arab universities or domestic-owned universities that are now privately owned. So are there any trends that you can see there, and does that differ to international brands that have been brought to the region?
Yeah, I think the only thing I could say there is with Dubai, what you will see is that the growth of the Western branch campuses has been stronger than the growth of some of the established Arabic brands, and that's because those British and Australian and Canadian brands that have entered are quite let's say, aggressive in terms of how they market. They do appeal to the expats more, but I can't say that. I can't say I know that for every market across the GCC. But as you'll see, Dubai is, as you'd have seen on slide 13, a market that is more dominated by the foreign university, brand. So I mean, hopefully that provides some guidance.
Okay. Another question that has come through is looking at how important the English medium international schools are for universities in MENA, and how dependent the universities are on these schools, on these types of schools being specifically in the English medium.
Yeah, I think these schools are naturally a feeder for the universities that are based in these markets. So we do see a lot of the universities, especially in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, go down to try and recruit at the at the British curriculum, the Indian curriculum, and IB and American curriculum schools to bring in students. So it absolutely is. They definitely need students to be of a certain quality as well. They have selection criteria as well, and they have eligibility criteria which students must meet to ensure that they can perform. And what we've seen in other markets where kids have come out of the public school system, we looked at Abu Dhabi. There was data that was published where 85% of the children who graduated from the public school system needed to do a one-year foundation program before they could enter university on a full-time basis. So, as I said, even in markets like Dubai, you're very reliant on not a global pool of students coming in. It's essentially people from the region and people within the city, within the UAE. So you do have to go and target K-12 schools, international schools within the Emirate and within the region to get your students.
Okay, one question is taking us a little deeper into the idea of investing into private education here, and specifically in North African countries or some of the other Middle Eastern countries where legal frameworks tend to be somewhat vague. How prepared do you think investors are to tackle some of the more complex or opaque legal frameworks that exist in some of these countries? Or are they far more prepared to stick to countries where this framework is already in place, as we've seen in Dubai and other Emirates?
Yeah, so again, if you look at how the market breaks down, in Saudi, where I think it's widely acknowledged, it's a very tough market to enter and structure your institution. You won't see very many foreign universities or foreign investors enter that market. It's much more locally focused. Similar to what happens in K-12 as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that does keep a lot of people away. And what hasn't helped is when you see some of the large private operators who have gone into post-secondary provision in Saudi Arabia, even with the support of the College of Excellence program, and found it very, very difficult to progress and grow enrollments. That also tends to push people back towards the markets that they feel more comfortable with, where the licensing and regulatory systems are much more simple and transparent, i.e. Dubai and to some extent also Abu Dhabi.
Okay, and in extending that idea in some ways, if we're looking at investing in different types of higher education operations,
Sorry, I'm losing you, Lydia, a little bit.
Okay, I'll repeat my question. There's been one question that's come in that's looking at opportunities for investment to services around higher education. A few people have talked about opportunities such as student loans or student housing. Is this an area that you've looked at? And is there interest in this side of the market?
Hi, Lydia. I was just not able to hear the question because it's breaking up.
Not a problem. I'll repeat that. Somebody's asked regarding opportunities for investment in ancillary services in education. And what is the opportunity for investing into such areas? Right, I do apologise. We seem to have lost our connection with Ashwin here. So what we would like to do is draw our webinar to a close now. We will gather up all the questions that people have asked here and endeavour to answer them to you directly by email. So we'd like to thank you again very much for joining us for the webinar. We do apologise that we've lost our moderator just at the very end, but hope that you found it beneficial. We will gather these questions and do our best to answer them for you, and you'll receive them all within the next couple of days. So again, thank you very much all for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you again on one of our future webinars. Thank you very much.
Lydia, hi. Sorry, it's impossible to hear you. I think your connection is down. If you could type in the question, that would be helpful. Okay, sorry about the technology issues. I think there was a question that came up with regards to student loans and student housing, and how is that as an investment vehicle. And again, from our experience, we haven't seen too much of that happen in the region. We've not been privy to it. We know that the IFC, which is a commercial arm of the World Bank, has looked at some student housing options in Turkey, student housing options in markets that are very well developed for students and international students, specifically like the UK, that has been an asset class that has been quite strongly with pretty good returns, especially for investors that are in a low interest rate environment. We haven't seen that really work. We have done a lot of work on student lending, and again, I think I would urge you to look at the report that we wrote with the IFC, which is available on the IFC the IFC's website. But again, what we've seen is that there's not been anything that's really scaled in this part of the world. So not in the Middle East at least, but the most successful investments in student lending market have happened actually in Brazil, which has a very buoyant private higher education market, which is exactly what you need to build a strong strong student lending product. Interestingly, it's also happened in Zambia through EduLoan. In Brazil, it was Ideal Invest. These are two things that you should look at if you're interested in student lending, as well as our IFC report. If anyone's interested in learning more about this, they can get in touch with me at the conference, and we have, we've studied around 80 models across the world to, to understand what works well and what doesn't. So that's, that's our view on student lending. I have got some more questions coming through. One question is, how eager are investors to invest in technologies that support higher education here? Our view, and this is more of a personal view, maybe a little bit colored, is that, again, we have not seen ed tech in this part of the world, even in the schools, which is traditionally where it's been strong, scale up, nor has it been scaled up in higher ed. When you look at some of the large companies that you talked about, Coursera and some of the other firms that are more global, they're still very small in real terms. They're global in scale, but in revenue terms, they're pretty small. In profitability, they're even smaller. So I think there's still a lot more to be done in this part of the world with bricks and mortar education on higher ed before you move into more of the online space. And again, when you speak to a lot of the employers in emerging markets, and including the GCC, the view that an online degree is as valuable and as is the same as a standard traditional degree, there's some skepticism to that, and that's what is pretty it's pretty evident when you speak to a number of the employers that we do. The next question we had is the Middle East economy big enough to absorb all the graduates from the region? I guess our view is, I don't have a definitive answer to that, but given that the economies across the region are diversifying away and trying to diversify away from from oil and manufacturing into other sectors, into service sectors which require people, I think there are opportunities, but increasingly I think it's the job of the universities in this region to help students not only get placed within the region, but also back into their home markets. And Chinese students love returning home because with a foreign degree, they do get a higher salary than they would have had they graduated in their own country, because their level of English is significantly better. There was one question on the gross enrollment ratio in Middle East countries. We have a chart on that. We could send you that. That isn't a problem. But if you look at Qatar, it's less than 25%. The UAE is sort of hovering around 50%. Saudi Arabia is around 50%. Compare that to countries like the USA, that's close to sort of 80%. And this is not only universities, that we're talking about post-secondary. So some education that kids are involved in post-graduation from school. The next question we have is, are there reputational challenges for international brands coming here if the quality of students is lower than the country of the original brand? That is absolutely that's a great point that you raised, and it is important to understand that. And to a large extent, even in Dubai, you haven't seen the likes of the prestige universities from the UK and the US enter because of that specific reason. That said, the institutions that have come in here do have standards in terms of ensuring that the kids can keep up with what's being taught in the classroom, and that these kids get jobs at the end of their degree. So what you raised is absolutely an important issue, especially for the prestige universities as they think about coming over. So I think this is all the time that we have for questions. Thank you everyone for participating. I hope you found the session useful. We should be able to share the presentation with you, and you can get in touch with Lydia. I look forward to meeting all of you, or some of you who are interested in learning more about the work that we're doing in MENA, not only in higher education, but in schools and now increasingly in early years. If you would like to reach out before the conference, we could book some time in our diaries to get together. But thank you for attending the webinar. We hope you find it useful, and we look forward to seeing you at the conference in the middle of November. Thanks very much.